The chicken was hot from the oven, tender and golden, carved with practiced hands. Doris Whitman set the last plate on the dining table, the one nearest the window where the sunset always caught the corner of her grandmother's china hutch. Her house, the same sturdy brick two-story on the east side of Columbus she'd managed on her own since '89, smelled like garlic, rosemary, and something slowly burning. Melissa didn't seem to notice. She was already seated, scrolling her phone with one manicured finger, nails the color of wine. Ethan sat across from her, watching Doris as she took her seat like she was interrupting something. Dinner began quietly. Silverware scraped politely. Melissa chewed with precision. Ethan reached for more potatoes. Then he cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom," he said, trying to sound casual. "Melissa's mom is coming to visit next week." Doris looked up, brow raised, fork poised just above her plate. "Oh?" Melissa smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "She doesn't do stairs, so we figured you'd stay in the basement while she uses the guest room." The word hit like a dropped glass. Basement. Doris blinked. Once. Ethan continued, unaware or unwilling to notice the shift in the air. "Yeah, just for a week. You've got the little cot and the TV down there, right?" "It's practical, really cozy," Melissa added. "Like a studio apartment." Doris set her fork down slowly, the faint tap on the plate louder than it should have been. She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Ethan took the silence as compliance. He shrugged and reached for more chicken. Melissa went back to her phone, typing something with a self-satisfied smirk. Doris folded her napkin and laid it neatly beside her plate. "Understood," she said calmly. No raised voice, no tremor, just one word, like a closed door. The rest of the meal dragged on with uncomfortable civility. Melissa talked about her Pilates instructor. Ethan discussed an office dispute like Doris had the context to care. No one asked her a single question, and Doris didn't offer anything up. She sat quietly, hands resting on her lap, listening to the sound of two people who had forgotten they were guests. After dinner, Melissa whisked her plate to the sink without so much as a thank you. Ethan turned on the television. Doris cleaned up, wiped the counters, and packed leftovers into containers that would no doubt disappear into their midnight snacking without credit. By 9 p.m., the house was dim. Melissa had already started laying out lavender pillow mist in the guest room. Ethan had left his socks on the rug. Doris moved down the hallway in silence, past the living room and into the narrow room she once used as an office. The air inside was still and cool, scented faintly of lemon oil and memory. A single brass lamp lit the corner desk. Beneath it sat the filing cabinet, 3 drawers tall, steel, and solid. It hadn't been opened in months. She bent, reached under the tray in her drawer, and retrieved a key. It slid into the top lock with a satisfying click. She opened the drawer slowly. Inside were 3 folders. One was marked DEEDS and TITLES in bold marker. The others were labeled taxes and receipts. Doris pulled the first one out and opened it on the desk. Her fingers, steady and clean, smoothed each page flat. The deed. The land transfer, the discharge of mortgage. Every inch of the house was hers. It always had been. She stared at the documents for a long moment, not with anger, not with fear, with clarity. They wanted her in the basement. She had just decided to take back the roof, and as the old house creaked under the weight of ungrateful guests above, Doris locked the folder back in its drawer, turned off the lamp, and stood a little taller than before. Tomorrow, they'd still be living under her roof. They just wouldn't know how temporary that arrangement had become. The morning sun broke through the blinds like truth slipping past excuses. Doris sat at the small desk in her office, the familiar creak of the old swivel chair grounding her as she flipped through documents with surgical precision. A steaming cup of black coffee rested near the edge of the desk, untouched. Her fingers were steady, her mind sharper than it had been in years. The folder marked deeds and titles lay open in front of her. On top sat the original deed to the house, signed and notarized. her name standing alone on the dotted line. No cosigners, no liens, no caveats, just her. She turned the page to the mortgage release letter dated 15 years ago, stamped, recorded, finalized. Paid in full. Next came the tax receipts. Organized by year, clipped with precision. She flipped through each one, her eyes pausing only briefly at the amounts. She'd paid every cent. Property taxes, utilities, home insurance. Her name was on every line item. The last section was filled with contractor invoices, receipts from roof repairs, plumbing upgrades, and new windows installed the winter Melissa had insisted on keeping the heat at 75. All signed by Doris. All paid by Doris. She smiled faintly. "Cozy basement, my foot," she murmured. A knock at the side door interrupted the silence. Doris didn't get up right away. She knew the rhythm of that knock. 3 slow, 1 sharp. Trevor Lane. When she opened the door, Trevor stood there with a cup holder carrying 2 coffees and a plastic bag of warm donuts. Same flannel shirt he always wore, fraying at the collar. "Brought reinforcements," he said, stepping inside. "Only if they come with legal advice," Doris replied, gesturing him toward the kitchen. They sat at the round table, the one Ethan and Melissa never used, claiming it was too small for entertaining. Doris slid the deed across the table like it was a poker hand she'd been waiting years to play. Trevor scanned the document, then leaned back. "Still just you on? Here?" "Always has been." He chuckled. "Well then, that makes things simple." "They're living rent-free in my house," Doris said, calling shots like they signed something other than a thank you card. Trevor sipped his coffee. "It's not just rent. It's control. People like Melissa treat generosity like a lease agreement, month to month and always subject to change." Doris reached for her tablet. "You'll love this." She tapped open her social media account, an app she rarely used but never deleted. Melissa's newest post was at the top. "Hosting family in our gorgeous home this week. Making room, making memories. Family first gracious, living." The photo showed her smugly smiling beside the fireplace, Doris's fireplace. Trevor let out a low whistle. "Our house, huh?" Doris took a screenshot. Saved it. Renamed the file. Exhibit A. Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Exhibit?" "I'm not throwing punches," she said. "I'm building a record." They sat in silence a moment. The only sounds were the birds outside and the soft, mocking ping of another social media notification. Trevor finished his donut, wiped his hands, and stood. "You know what you're doing." Doris looked up at him, calm as a lake before a storm. "I'm about to remind them what ownership actually means." Trevor nodded, squeezed her shoulder once, and let himself out. As the door clicked shut, Doris picked up her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't touched in years, but never deleted. Shelby Moore, housing attorney. She tapped the number, let it ring. When the line picked up, she said, "Shelby? It's Doris Whitman. I think it's time we talk about the terms of living under someone else's roof." Shelby Moore's office smelled like lemon oil and litigation. Hardwood floors gleamed under the early morning sun pouring through tall windows, and every document on her desk was aligned with deliberate care. She didn't decorate much, just a framed diploma, a clock that didn't tick, and a paperweight shaped like a gavel. Doris sat opposite her, hands folded over her purse, like she was waiting for a medical diagnosis she already suspected. The manila folder between them was thick, clipped tightly, its contents quietly damning. Shelby slipped on her glasses and flipped through the documents with a measured rhythm. The room was quiet except for the soft slide of pages and the occasional scratch of Shelby's pen. She didn't speak for several minutes, didn't need to. The paperwork did the talking. Finally, Shelby looked up. "You are the sole legal owner. No joint tenancy, no surviving spouse clause. Paid off in 2008. Property taxes current. Utilities in your name. Maintenance and insurance handled solely by you." She removed her glasses, setting them on the desk. Doris, this house is yours, free and clear. Doris gave a single nod. She didn't smile. Shelby leaned back in her chair. Now, you said your son and daughter-in-law have been living with you how long? On and off for 3 years. Since Ethan got passed over for promotion, they transitioned to my guest room full-time. Shelby arched an eyebrow. Transitioned. Nice word for moved in without paying rent. They act like they're doing me a favor by breathing in my air, Doris said flatly. Shelby tapped the edge of the folder. You have 2 options. First, I can draft a lease agreement. You set the terms, rent, utilities, behavior clauses, whatever boundaries you need. Second, eviction, legal notice, 30-day timeline. If they don't comply, we escalate to court and bring in a sheriff if necessary. Doris's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something colder. They'll learn the price of free lodging. Shelby gave a half chuckle and began typing on her keyboard. Her fingers moved fast, but her eyes remained focused. You want both documents prepared? No. Just the second one. Shelby stopped typing, looked up. I'm not interested in salvaging this arrangement, Doris said. They gave me their terms. I'm giving them mine. Shelby resumed typing, faster now. The laser printer beside the desk hummed to life, spitting out the first few pages of what would become a very unwelcome wake-up call. You're sure about this? As sure as Melissa was when she told me to sleep next to the water heater. Shelby grinned. All right then. Let's make this permanent. She added a clause regarding property misuse, a second clause about guest limitations, and a final section about prior damages, leaving space for attachments, photos, receipts, anything else Doris wanted to include. You'll want to keep copies, Shelby said. One for them, one for you, one for court, if it comes to that. Doris tucked the papers into her purse like she was sliding a knife back into its sheath. Shelby tapped her pen against the desk once. Now, last question. Doris raised an eyebrow. Do you want me to serve them myself? Quietly, via certified mail, or, Shelby leaned forward just slightly, do you want a sheriff to knock on that door and hand them the reality they've been pretending doesn't exist? The office held a long breath between them, and then Doris's eyes narrowed, not in uncertainty, but calculation. She wasn't just thinking about paperwork. She was thinking about presentation. The mail carrier's knock wasn't hurried. It was firm, official. 3 raps on the door that echoed through the quiet house like a verdict. Ethan stood in the foyer, mid-bite of a banana, when the sound froze him in place. He glanced down at his mismatched socks, then back toward the door. Something about that knock felt pointed. Melissa appeared behind him, wearing a silk robe and an expression that suggested she hadn't liked being disturbed. Go see who it is, she said, already annoyed. When Ethan opened the door, the mail carrier held out a clipboard and 2 thick envelopes stamped certified mail. Signature required in bold red ink. You're Ethan Whitman, the carrier asked, pen ready. Ethan nodded slowly and scribbled his name. As the envelopes exchanged hands, the air felt heavier, like something permanent had just shifted. Melissa ripped hers open the second it hit her fingers. The crackle of tearing paper echoed through the entryway. Her lips moved silently as she skimmed the first page, then the second. Her expression twisted in real time. Curiosity curdled into disbelief. Disbelief soured into fury. You've got to be kidding me, she hissed, voice rising. She's evicting us. Ethan blinked, still holding his own unopened envelope like it might bite him. Evicting? He echoed. Can she do that? Melissa spun on him. We live here, Ethan. We've built our lives here. We've stayed here, he said. There's a difference. You're missing the point, Melissa snapped, waving the notice like a flag. This is a legal eviction notice. From your mother. Across the street, Doris stood in the front garden, pruning her rose bushes in a wide-brimmed sun hat. The clippers clicked steadily, snip, pause, snip, each cut deliberate, each bloom falling like punctuation. She didn't glance toward the house, though the shouting inside was clearly audible. A car slowed as it passed. Neighbors looked from their windows. Curtains fluttered. Suburban life was built on quiet spectacle, and this one was just beginning to unfold. From her porch, Paula Morgan narrowed her eyes behind her bifocals. She stood with a watering can in one hand and a mild smirk tugging at her lips. "Everything okay over there?" she called out, loud enough for the entire block to hear. Doris didn't miss a beat. "Just housekeeping," she replied. Ethan finally tore open his own envelope. The language was crisp, formal, and indisputable. Notice to vacate, 30 days. Failure to comply will result in legal proceedings. His stomach flipped. The words blurred. Back inside, Melissa was pacing now, robe flying with each turn. She's lost it. She's senile. That has to be it. Maybe we can file something. Get it thrown out. Ethan looked dazed. Maybe we should talk to her. Oh, talk to her. Now we want to talk to her, Melissa barked. The woman who sent us eviction notices under the same roof? Number. We fight this. In court if we have to. Doris, meanwhile, crouched beside the final row of roses, brushing petals from her gloves. She glanced up briefly, taking in the silhouettes behind the drawn curtains, the sound of muffled yelling, the way the wind rustled her American flag just enough to keep it from feeling theatrical. She stood, wiped her hands, and breathed in the scent of fresh blooms mixed with something sharper. Burned pride, maybe. Or the scent of power, returned. Inside, Melissa slammed her hand against the kitchen counter. "We are not going anywhere." Ethan, finally cracking under pressure, muttered, "You think court's the right move?" Melissa didn't answer. She turned, eyes blazing, and said the words loud enough to be heard through the double-pane windows. "We're fighting this in court. If she wants a battle, she's got one." And across the street, Paula set down her watering can with a gentle clink, lips curling into something halfway between amusement and prophecy. "Well," she murmured to herself, "this just got interesting." Shelby's heels echoed across the marble floor of the Franklin County Courthouse as she handed over the stamped eviction filing. The clerk gave a perfunctory nod, unaware she was sealing the fate of a family war already set ablaze. Outside, the late morning air smelled of city grit and autumn leaves. Shelby called Doris the moment she stepped back onto the sidewalk. "It's filed," she said. "The clock is officially ticking." Doris stood at her kitchen window, trimming green beans with exacting precision. She didn't pause. Good. Let's see what they do when they run out of room to bluff. They didn't wait long. By that evening, whispers had begun. Melissa made the rounds at her favorite salon and her Pilates studio, injecting her version of events into any ear that would tilt toward her. "She's not well," she said to a sympathetic hairstylist, tilting her head with mock concern. "I mean, who evicts their own son? We think she's confused. It's probably early stage, you know." She let the suggestion hang like perfume. At the hardware store the next day, Trevor Lane leaned on the paint counter, chatting casually with an employee when he overheard a pair of younger women discussing some poor lady being booted from her own home. Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Lady's name, Doris Whitman?" They nodded. "Funny," he said, pulling out his phone and flipping it to a photo of the deed. "Because her name's still on every line of ownership." Front to back, the rumor sputtered. Later that afternoon, Ethan stormed into the living room where Doris was dusting the bookshelves. He didn't knock. He didn't greet. He was shaking with frustration that had clearly been building all week. "You don't evict your own family," he snapped, voice cracking. Doris turned, cloth in hand, eyes cool. "Family doesn't exile their mother to a basement to make room for a guest," she replied. "You wanted authority without responsibility. I'm correcting that imbalance." Ethan's mouth opened to argue, but nothing came out. Across town, Renee Foster pulled on her gloves and stepped into the guest bathroom for the third time that day. She crouched beside the vanity, camera in hand, and aimed the lens at the warped floorboards and mildew-cracked grout. When she removed the panel behind the toilet, she clicked her tongue. The piping was mismatched. Some of it corroded copper spliced with flexible PVC. The work was clearly amateur, unpermitted, dangerous. She took 6 photos. Downstairs, she opened the basement access door and was hit with a musty wave of damp air. More clicking. One shot of the exposed beams with blackened water stains. Another of the sagging ductwork. When she stepped outside and felt clean air again, she scribbled her final notes. Unpermitted remodel, likely occupant-driven, plumbing below code, water intrusion evident, immediate repair recommended. That night, Doris placed a manila envelope on her kitchen counter and slid it across to Shelby, like it was an ace card in a poker game. Renee's report, she said, photos included. Shelby leafed through the contents, one eyebrow slowly rising. They're not just squatting, she muttered. They're depreciating the asset. Melissa had tried to hide her bathroom remodel, new mirror, upgraded tile, a trendy basin sink. But the rushed craftsmanship and unlicensed work left behind a trail that couldn't be wallpapered over. Shelby pulled out her phone and began typing. This changes things. We're no longer just evicting. We're filing for damages. Doris didn't gloat. She simply poured herself a cup of tea, steam curling upward, her hands steady. They wanted me in the basement, she said. Instead, I'll bury them in paperwork. Shelby looked up. You understand this could go beyond eviction now. Court claims, inspectors, fees, reputation fallout. I'm not worried about fallout, Doris replied. I'm worried about setting precedent. They came into my home like owners. Let them leave like tenants who broke the lease. Shelby smiled. It wasn't a soft smile. It was the kind you make when you realize your opponent never learned how contracts work. Then we moved to amend the claim, she said, tapping her keyboard as documents began to spool. Let's charge them for every cracked pipe and rotten wall they tried to bury behind a coat of paint. By the time the court received the updated filing, Melissa's smug remodel had become legal ammunition. The eviction had grown teeth, and outside, the rain began to fall, lightly at first, washing away the last of the roses as the house prepared for war. The courtroom was too cold, the fluorescent lights too sharp. A faint scent of paper and floor polish lingered in the air, sterile and unforgiving. Doris sat calmly in the third row, her leather-bound binder resting on her lap like a weapon holstered in plain view. At the front, Renee Foster adjusted the mic on the witness stand, her inspection report open in front of her. She wasn't nervous. Renee had testified in enough property hearings to recognize when something was about to tip from personal to legal carnage. This case had that scent. Please describe what you observed during your inspection, the judge said. Renee nodded. The property had several unpermitted modifications. The upstairs guest bathroom had extensive water damage behind the wall panels. The plumbing was replaced with mixed materials, copper and flexible plastic, without support braces or insulation. There was mold, black mold. Gasps rustled in the gallery. Melissa shifted in her seat, arms crossed, nostrils flared. Ethan sat beside her, his posture slumped like the air had been knocked out of him. The basement, Renee continued, showed evidence of flooding, staining on the walls, floor swelling. Improper drainage. Shelby rose from the plaintiff's table. Were these issues reported by the homeowner? No, Renee said flatly. They were discovered during a scheduled private inspection at the request of the legal owner, Mrs. Doris Whitman Shelby. Turned to the judge. I'd like to submit these findings into evidence, Your Honor. Including the date-stamped photographs, the judge gestured. Proceed. As the monitor blinked to life, the photos glowed across the courtroom, warped beams, cracked tile, a hastily patched pipe that looked like it had been sealed with duct tape. Ethan let out a long breath, then muttered just loud enough to hear, "It was just cosmetic stuff." Melissa shot him a glare that could curdle blood. "Shut up," she hissed under her breath. Doris didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Her grip on the binder tightened by a fraction, her nails tapping once, just once, against the leather. The judge studied the photos for a moment, then flicked his eyes toward the defendants. Do you have permits for any of this work? Melissa's silence stretched so long it felt like its own answer. Shelby took that moment to rise again. Your Honor, due to the state of disrepair and code violations documented in Ms. Foster's report, I am filing an emergency motion to preserve the property. We ask that no further modifications be made without court approval. The judge nodded slowly. Granted. Outside the courtroom, Doris and Shelby walked side by side, binder now tucked securely under Doris's arm. The air was thicker in the hallway, but there was a bite of satisfaction in it too. Shelby turned slightly. That report changes the dynamic. This isn't just about eviction anymore. It's about negligence, maybe endangerment. They wanted me underground, Doris said, brushing a strand of silver hair from her temple. But I won't be buried. I'll bury them in paperwork instead, Shelby gave a tight, impressed smile. We'll keep pressing. I'm filing for an official property injunction this week. Make it sharp, Doris replied, and permanent. The next morning, the official court hearing date landed in Shelby's inbox. She printed it without delay and walked it straight to Doris's kitchen, where a pot of coffee was already percolating, and a legal pad sat open beside a plate of lemon shortbread. The hearing's locked in, Shelby said, placing the paper gently on the counter. Doris glanced at the date. Good, she murmured. They're going to learn what real foundation looks like. From across the street, Paula Morgan watched Shelby's car pull away. She sat in a lawn chair, crossword folded across her knee, and tilted her chin as Doris stepped outside with her coffee. More legal mail? Paula called. Just a date, Doris replied with a small, unreadable smile. Can't wait to mark my calendar, Paula muttered, eyes twinkling. Inside the Whitman house, Melissa slammed a cupboard shut so hard a plate rattled loose and cracked in the sink. The weight of the evidence, the photos, the smell of mold that now felt imagined but inescapable. It clung to her like guilt. And somewhere beneath it all, she knew the floor they stood on wasn't the only thing about to collapse. The courtroom buzzed with quiet whispers as the parties took their seats. Fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, humming just loud enough to add attention of their own. At the plaintiff's table, Doris Whitman sat poised, a navy blue sweater tucked neatly over pressed slacks, her hands resting calmly on a yellow legal pad. Beside her, Shelby Moore slid open her binder, each tab color-coded and marked like a battlefield map. Across the aisle, Melissa Whitman entered like she owned the place. Her blazer was crisp, heels sharp, and expression sharper. She tugged on the cuffs of her blouse and gave a forced smile to the bailiff, as if charm might carry more weight than facts. Ethan trailed behind her, shirt untucked at the back and tie knotted in a lopsided clump. He looked like a man dragged in by consequence rather than choice. Shelby leaned toward Doris. She's dressed for war. Doris didn't look up. And unarmed, the bailiff called. All rise, and Judge Camden entered. Glasses perched low on his nose, stack of papers in hand. He scanned the courtroom once before settling into his chair. We are here to review case number 23, CV781, Whitman versus Whitman, regarding property ownership and potential eviction proceedings. He peered over his glasses. Let's begin with ownership. Shelby stood. Your Honor, as previously filed, the deed to 302 Haverhill Avenue remains solely in my client's name, Doris Whitman. There are no co-signers, no liens, and the mortgage has been paid in full for over a decade. She handed a folder to the clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Melissa stood abruptly, her heels clicking loud against the linoleum. Objection. The judge raised an eyebrow. We're not at objections yet, Mrs. Whitman. I'm not denying the deed, Melissa said, smoothing her skirt. But I've contributed to that home. Sweat equity, Your Honor. Upgrades. Maintenance. We turned the basement into a livable space, renovated the guest bathroom. Shelby rose smoothly. Your Honor, those modifications were done without permits. In fact, the city has opened a preliminary investigation into the unauthorized renovations, which we'll address shortly. But equity, legally, is not claimed by effort. It's claimed by contract. And Melissa Whitman is neither tenant nor co-owner. She's an informal guest, The judge thumbed through the file. The deed is clear. He looked toward Melissa. Did you request permission for the renovations? Melissa paused too long. We were under the impression. That's a no, the judge cut in. This court does not operate on impressions. It operates on documentation. Ethan cleared his throat, voice low. We didn't think it mattered. It's family. Doris turned her head slowly. Family doesn't corner their own into a basement. The words dropped like a stone, silencing even the rustle of papers in the courtroom. Ethan flinched. Melissa shifted in her seat, but said nothing. Shelby flipped to the next divider in her binder. Your Honor, my client's concern is not just about disrespect. It's about property integrity. Code violations, mold, and plumbing hazards were found in the areas they claimed to have renovated. We have inspection results and photo evidence, which we're prepared to present. The judge nodded, expression unreadable. Then let's do this by the book. Miss Moore, please submit the inspection documentation at the next hearing. I want copies, timestamps, and testimony, if applicable. Shelby gave a single nod. Understood. He banged the gavel lightly. Next session is scheduled for 1 week from today. Until then, no further modifications to the property by any party. Is that clear? Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Ethan rubbed his temple. As the courtroom emptied, Doris didn't move immediately. She sat still, spine straight, watching the defense shuffle out, their confidence leaking with every step. Shelby packed up her notes and leaned in, voice low. They're slipping. That inspection report is a guillotine, Doris. Doris stood, smoothed the front of her sweater, and smiled without warmth. Good, because next week I'll be handing them the blade. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the bailiff wheeled in a projection cart. A white screen unfurled at the front wall, humming as it dropped. Doris sat with her hands clasped neatly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. Her expression was unreadable, lips pressed into a polite, practiced line. Shelby Moore sat beside her, flipping to a marked tab in her binder, her expression taut with anticipation. On the defense side, Melissa crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her red blazer, bold and defiant in color, had begun to wilt at the collar from the heat of the room. Ethan slouched beside her, his gaze pinned to the floor like a scolded child. Judge Camden leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Let's proceed with the inspection evidence, he said, voice steady but low enough to slice tension through the room like a cold knife. Shelby stood. Your Honor, we've invited Renee Foster, licensed property inspector, to present her findings from 302 Haverhill Avenue. The report is time-stamped, signed, and notarized. No alterations have been made to the materials since filing. Renee approached the projector with clinical precision, her pressed gray slacks and slate blouse mirroring her calm, no-nonsense demeanor. She adjusted the laptop, clicked, and the first photo lit up the screen. A close-up of black mold blooming like ink blots behind the basement drywall. A ripple passed through the courtroom gallery. This, Renee began, was found behind a newly installed panel, approximately 8 feet from the basement furnace. The homeowner, Miss Whitman, was unaware of any modifications until this inspection. The next slide showed cracked wooden joists, the beams looking like splintered ribs under the weight of negligence. Renee clicked again. This is beneath the guest bathroom floor. Joists compromised by unapproved pipe routing. Melissa shifted in her seat, her shoe tapping a fast, uneven rhythm against the floor. And here, Renee continued, advancing to a photo of jagged PVC pipes hacked mid-wall, insulation spilling out like cotton from a torn pillow, are the results of an incomplete reroute for a second sink, installed without permits, which we confirmed through city records. Judge Camden let out a slow, audible breath. Unauthorized alterations, he murmured, eyes narrowing, clear as day. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan reached out and gripped her wrist, lightly but enough. She snapped her arm away and muttered something under her breath, lips pinched white. Doris sat motionless. The only visible movement was the steady rise and fall of her chest, slow and controlled. Shelby flipped the next tab and handed up printed copies of the report. Your Honor, these photos and descriptions are included in the full submission already on record. We're requesting that these be admitted as part of our claim for damages and code violations. Filed accordingly, the judge replied, sliding the packet aside. From the gallery, low murmurs swelled. A woman whispered, "How could anyone treat their own mother like that?" Another voice hushed a reply. Near the back, Paula Morgan leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowed. "Should have kept her upstairs," she muttered, almost to herself. The screen went dark as Renee shut the laptop, nodding once to the judge. "That concludes my findings, Your Honor." Judge Camden tapped his pen against the bench. "Noted. Final hearing date will be set after a brief recess." The gavel sounded, and the tension in the room exploded into movement. Voices rose, chairs scraped, and the gallery buzzed with half-whispers and sidelong glances. Doris stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse with hands that didn't shake. Shelby packed up her binder. Neither of them spoke. Out in the hallway, Melissa cornered Ethan near the restroom alcove. Her whisper was sharp, venomous. "She's not winning. I don't care what pictures she has. We'll destroy her reputation before this is over." Ethan looked toward the courtroom doors, then back at her. His silence spoke volumes. Unseen by either of them, Doris paused just around the corner, listening. Her lips curled ever so slightly, not into a smile, but something closer to resolve. The war wasn't over, but they'd just handed her their next mistake. On record, in a hallway, under the courthouse lights. It started at the grocery store. Doris noticed a cashier whisper to another just as she handed over her debit card. A glance, a smirk, then a too loud, "Have a great day, Miss Whitman," dripping with the false sweetness of someone who believed the worst. The rumors had spread like mold behind drywall, quiet, toxic, and difficult to trace. Melissa was everywhere, fanning flames. "She's running out of money," she told anyone who'd listen at the salon. "She's old and confused, bless her heart. That house is too much for her." On Facebook groups, under her name and anonymous ones, she seeded the same idea. Doris was unstable, grasping, and bitter. But Trevor heard, and Trevor had receipts. Doris didn't even have to ask. One afternoon, he dropped a thick envelope onto her kitchen table, the same one Melissa once demanded she abandon for the basement. Inside were printouts, bank statements, redacted to maintain privacy, notarized summaries of her holdings, contractor invoices for upgrades she'd paid for in full, and even her credit score. Immaculate, untouchable. "Put it through Shelby," Trevor said, sipping from a mug Doris had given him years ago. "Let her do what lawyers do best." Shelby did more than that. She drafted a defamation countersuit so sharp it could draw blood just by being glanced at. Laced with language about character assassination, reputational damage, and malicious intent, it was packed with screenshots from Melissa's social media, sworn affidavits from neighbors, and notarized bank certifications Trevor helped collect. When Shelby emailed the draft for approval, Doris scrolled to the bottom, then typed a single word. Approved. But just as the legal gears turned, the family rot surfaced again. A message pinged on Doris's phone at 11:42 p.m. "Ethan, if I leave her, would you let me stay?" The nerve, after all the smirking, the silence, the basement, after weeks of watching Melissa humiliate her in public, while Ethan stood by like furniture. Doris tapped her reply without a flicker of hesitation. "Doris, you both laughed. Now you both pay." She didn't get a response. The following week in court, Melissa's attorney attempted to submit a motion arguing for a character reassessment of Doris, something about mental decline and erratic behavior. Judge Camden didn't even let it breathe. He glanced at Shelby's countersuit and the evidence packet, then sighed heavily. "This isn't just speculative," he said, sliding Melissa's motion back across the bench. "It's slander wrapped in legal jargon." Motion denied. Melissa's cheeks flared crimson. Ethan kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched. Outside the courthouse, Shelby clapped her binder shut with a snap. "That'll be a line in your memoir one day," she said to Doris. They slung mud. "You handed them mirrors," Doris almost smiled. "And they don't like what they see." But the twist hadn't landed yet. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the maple trees lining Haverhill Avenue, Doris walked to her driveway to retrieve the mail. Her sandals crunched softly on the gravel. She reached the mailbox and stopped cold. The windshield of her sedan was shattered, not cracked, not chipped. Shattered, an intricate spiderweb of glass exploding outward from the driver's side, the impact center the size of a clenched fist. Glass glittered across the dashboard. A broken garden brick lay on the floorboard. Doris stood still, long enough for Paula across the street to come outside, phone in hand. "I already called it in," she said. "Heard the sound right before dinner." When the police arrived, they took photos, collected the brick, and reviewed nearby footage from a neighbor's security cam. Doris gave a statement, calm as stone. "I have a suspicion who it was," she said. But she didn't have to guess for long. At 10:37 that night, Ethan texted again. This time, it was shorter. "Ethan. She did it. Melissa. I didn't stop her." Doris stared at the screen for a long moment. The air in her living room was still. Outside, the police car's headlights slowly pulled away from the curb. She set the phone down without replying. Tomorrow, this would be a criminal matter. Tonight, she simply turned off the lamp, leaving the room in silence, except for the satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in pulses of warning and consequence. Doris stood on her driveway in a pale gray cardigan, the cool night air tugging gently at the hem. Her hands were folded neatly, expression unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on the spiderwebbed windshield of her car, like it was a signed confession. Melissa hadn't even bothered to hide it. The garden brick that had once rested in Doris's flower bed now sat like a smug trophy in the front seat, surrounded by shattered safety glass, glinting under the moonlight. Officer Blake crouched to photograph the brick, his gloved hands methodical. "Intentional," he muttered. "No doubt." Renee arrived minutes later, summoned by Shelby for documentation. Her camera clicked and flashed in quick succession, every angle captured. The dents on the hood, the fragments beneath the tires, the thin scratches along the driver's side door. Evidence. Precise. Unforgiving. Doris handed Renee a sealed envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of Ethan's late-night text. "She did it. Melissa. I didn't stop her." Renee tucked it in her file. That's enough to move forward with additional charges. As the police completed their statements, Melissa appeared at the edge of the lawn, arms crossed, wearing an oversized hoodie and zero remorse. "You really called the cops over a car window," she snapped. Ethan trailed behind her, eyes downcast, hands deep in his pockets. Doris didn't speak. She turned, stepped past the officers, and went into the garage. A few minutes later, she returned with a broom and dustpan. The streetlight above her flickered, casting her in a soft cone of gold as she knelt beside the car. The sound of glass scraping into the dustpan was sharp and deliberate, like a closing door. Melissa took a step forward. "You know, all of this," she gestured around wildly, "could have been avoided if you just acted like a normal mother instead of a landlord." Officer Blake stepped between them. "Ma'am, that's enough. You're being cited for vandalism. Court summons will be issued within the week." Melissa recoiled, fury bubbling just beneath her skin. "Oh, please. It's her word against—" "No," Doris interrupted softly, still kneeling. "It's your husband's text. Your brick, my car, and 4 witnesses." For the first time, Melissa faltered. Ethan behind her looked like he might fold in half. Shelby arrived minutes later, clicking across the driveway in black pumps and a navy trench coat. "I'll be filing to amend the suit," she said, nodding to the vehicle. "Criminal mischief, property damage, and retaliation during pending eviction." Melissa spat out a laugh. "You can't be serious." Shelby's smile didn't touch her eyes. "Oh, I'm always serious." Ask the last person who underestimated me. Doris rose, dustpan in hand, and turned toward the garage without another glance at Melissa. She dumped the shards of glass into a black bin lined with newspaper, then pulled the garage doors shut behind her with a low metallic rumble. Across the street, Paula stood with arms folded and her dog leash looped around one wrist. Her mutt sniffed the grass, while Paula watched with a face carved from stone. Not even windows respect them, she muttered under her breath. The following morning, an official notice from the court arrived. Final eviction hearing scheduled. 10 a.m. tomorrow. All parties to be present. Ruling will be delivered at close of session. Doris read it once, then pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a cardinal. Calmly, she returned to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of black coffee, and sat at the table overlooking the backyard. The storm was nearly over, but storms don't leave without mud. Down the hall, her briefcase sat open. The eviction folder now nearly 2 inches thick. Photos, receipts, blueprints, affidavits. There was no guesswork left, just facts, and the consequences those facts would deliver. Outside, Melissa paced the porch, speaking on her phone in sharp, hushed tones. Ethan sat on the steps with his face in his hands. The very steps Doris had paid to be resurfaced 3 years ago. The steps they thought they could inherit by pushing her beneath them. Tomorrow, the steps would belong to her again. Officially. And this time, they'd be walking down them for good. The courtroom air was thick with tension, like the charge before a summer thunderstorm. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting dusty beams across the wooden floor. The faint hum of the ceiling fan did little to cool the nerves of the people seated on either side of the aisle. Doris sat upright in her navy blouse, hands folded neatly on the oak table in front of her. Beside her, Shelby adjusted her blazer collar with the ease of someone who'd already read the final page of the book. Ethan and Melissa were across the room, slouched in their seats. Melissa's arms were crossed tight over her chest, her lipstick a shade too aggressive for a courtroom. Ethan stared at the table, eyes sunken. His suit rumpled like it had been retrieved from the back seat of a car. Judge Camden entered briskly, robes flowing behind him. The chatter evaporated instantly. "Let's get to it," he said, voice flat but firm. "This court has reviewed the documentation provided regarding the eviction proceedings of Doris Whitman versus Ethan and Melissa Whitman." Shelby stood smoothly. "Your Honor, I'd like to walk through the timeline, briefly but clearly." She clicked her pen and began. Insult. That's where it started. An elderly homeowner was told by her own son and daughter-in-law to relocate to the basement of the home she owns outright, solely, fully. That conversation was followed by an official notice served to them, offering either terms for formal tenancy or exit. She paced slowly, measured. They chose neither. Instead, they retaliated. We presented evidence of mold from an unauthorized bathroom remodel. Then came intimidation tactics, defamation, destruction of property, and finally, vandalism. The photographs of the car, the police report, and text message confession are all submitted into the court file. Melissa shot to her feet. That car wasn't even Mrs. Whitman, Judge Camden said, not looking up. "You are not permitted to speak unless directed." "Sit down or you'll be removed." Her heels clicked as she slumped back down, huffing. Shelby didn't flinch. "My client has been calm, measured, and legal every step of the way. The same cannot be said for the defendants." Judge Camden tapped his fingers against the bench, then exhaled deeply. "I've seen many cases where family drama spills into courtrooms. It's never pleasant, but rarely is the law so clear." He turned the printed deed over in his hand. "This house belongs to Doris Whitman." Legally, entirely, the defendants were offered options. They responded with defiance, falsehoods, and damages. Both to the property and to Miss Whitman's peace of mind, Doris didn't move. Her breath came shallow and even. The judge continued. "Eviction is granted. You have 14 days to vacate the premises. Full restitution for property damage is also awarded to Miss Whitman, amount to be finalized following itemized assessment. Ethan's jaw dropped. Melissa's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious, Melissa whispered, half rising again. This is not a negotiation, Judge Camden snapped, gaze sharp as cut glass. It's a ruling. One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. He banged the gavel once. Court is adjourned. Chairs scraped. Murmurs rose. But Doris didn't stand right away. She looked straight ahead, her face unreadable. Not victorious, not smug, just resolved. Like someone who had seen every move play out exactly as she'd expected. Outside the courthouse, the September wind carried the scent of cut grass and distant traffic. Shelby pulled out her phone, answering a call with a clipped, "Yes, it's done." Doris stood by the stone steps, adjusting her cardigan. The lines on her face were softened by the sunlight, but her eyes still held steel. Melissa stormed past with clenched fists and a voice thick with venom. "I'll never pay her a cent," she spat to no one in particular. Shelby raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Ethan trailed behind, his shoulders hunched. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he hesitated, just long enough for Doris to see the glimmer of guilt flicker behind his exhausted expression. She didn't stop him. She didn't speak. The moment didn't require words. The law had spoken. The house was hers. But the silence, that belonged to them now. The courtroom fell quiet again as the judge tapped his pen against the edge of the bench. He adjusted his reading glasses, flipping through a folder thick with photographs, invoices, and a damage assessment that told a story louder than any testimony. Based on the licensed inspection submitted, the total damage caused by unauthorized remodeling and subsequent neglect equals $23,640.12, he said plainly, looking up. This court orders the defendants to pay that amount to Ms. Doris Whitman in full. Melissa's jaw clenched so hard it clicked. Her breath came. In short, hot bursts, nostrils flaring. "That's absurd," she hissed. "That bathroom was an improvement." "Mrs. Whitman," the judge warned, "your opinion on what qualifies as improvement doesn't override code violations and structural damage. This is not a debate." Ethan sat slumped beside her, white-knuckled hands gripping the edge of the table like he was holding on to a life raft. His tie had come undone, the knot sliding off center, his eyes avoiding everyone, even the floor. When the gavel fell, the weight in the room didn't lift. It shifted, crushing only one side now. Outside, the sky was bright and clean, the kind of post-rain September blue that made everything seem sharper. Doris stood at the top of the courthouse steps, her spine straight as the pillars behind her. The papers in her folder barely rustled in the breeze. She didn't need to look behind her to know the destruction was still clattering down the marble stairs. Trevor stepped beside her with a small grin, his arms crossed. "Basement of regret," he said, nodding toward the doors behind them. "Served piping hot." Doris didn't laugh, but her lips curled faintly. And with interest, they watched as Melissa stormed out, stilettos stabbing the concrete with every step. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the flush of rage blooming beneath her cheekbones. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just brushed past Ethan so hard his shoulder rocked backward. He followed behind her, slower, like someone sentenced to follow someone else's disaster. "I hope they like payment plans," Trevor added, then tilted his head. "She'll make his life hell." "She already did," Doris murmured. By the time they reached the parking lot, Renee was waiting by her car, clipboard in hand. She waved, then held up a manila envelope. "Final schedules in. Everything tallied, permits filed, contractors lined up. You'll be back to pre-Melissa condition in 6 weeks. Tops." "Thank you," Doris replied. She accepted the envelope like it was the last missing piece of a puzzle. Trevor chuckled. Felt like a renovation saga and court case in one. "More like pest control," Doris said, eyes steady. Later that evening, as dusk folded over the rooftops of Columbus, Doris sat at her kitchen table, the scent of rosemary and fresh varnish from the new window trim still lingering in the air. The deed lay flat in front of her, along with a one-page document she'd asked Shelby to draft earlier that week. With a slow, deliberate hand, Doris signed the paper, locking the property into her living trust. No loopholes, no inheritance battles, no second chances. When the pen clicked closed, she didn't look relieved. She looked complete. Just after 9, a car door slammed outside. Doris peered through the front window, her fingers brushing aside the curtain with quiet curiosity. Ethan stood at the curb, head low, shoulders slumped. He didn't walk toward the house, just waited. Then Melissa stepped out of the car, hair tied tight, heels clacking. She didn't look at him. Instead, she reached into her handbag, pulled out a thick envelope, and shoved it into his chest. Ethan blinked, holding it awkwardly. Then he looked up, his face drained, mouth open. Melissa said nothing. She simply turned, climbed back into the driver's seat, and pulled away without a backward glance. Ethan stood there for a long time, holding that envelope like it weighed more than the courthouse judgment. Inside the house, Doris stepped back from the window, turned off the light, and left the room in silence. Some papers were just the beginning of endings. The letter came in a thick cream envelope with embossed initials and a Columbus Law Office return address. Ethan had barely closed the apartment door behind him before Melissa's legal intentions slid from his hands and onto the cracked tile floor. Petition for dissolution of marriage was stamped in bold across the top. He stared at the words for a long time before lowering himself into the thrift store armchair beside a flickering floor lamp. Paint peeled on the walls like shedding skin. A single fly buzzed around a microwave that smelled faintly of burnt plastic. A cardboard box labeled kitchen stuff still sat unopened near the kitchenette sink, untouched since he moved in 4 days earlier. Melissa's reason was blunt, boxed in legal phrases, irreconcilable differences, and financial strain. There was no preamble, no apology, not even a handwritten signature. Just digital ink and her attorney's flourish beneath it. He'd expected anger, maybe bitterness, but not silence, not abandonment, not the kind of clean break that made him feel like an old appliance, used until broken, now left on the curb. She was cutting herself loose before the debts could bleed into her next chapter. He scrolled through his phone with numb fingers and hovered over his mother's name. The text he finally sent was short. "Can I come home?" It was delivered. Red never answered. Back on Fairhill Lane, Doris didn't even flinch when the notification lit her screen. She stared at the message for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then tapped delete with a calm, final motion. It vanished, like dust wiped off a polished surface. She took a sip of tea and folded laundry while the neighborhood settled into its evening quiet. A cardinal chirped from the elm outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Across the road, Paula stood watering her zinnias. She looked up as Doris stepped onto the porch with a folded towel in hand. "Word is," Paula called. Melissa hit the eject button. Doris nodded once. "Dropped him faster than the plumbing bill," Paula snorted. "Poetic, don't you think? Basement living suits him." The laugh between them was short and dry, stripped of malice but full of history. Ethan's new address, apartment 1B in a rundown rental near East Broad Street, was already common knowledge among their little cul-de-sac. Word spread faster than weeds in a cracked driveway. Rumor had it he was paying double in rent what he used to not pay under his mother's roof. Inside his small apartment, Ethan dragged a space heater closer to his feet. The central unit had died again, and maintenance hadn't returned his calls. The ceiling light buzzed overhead, casting a cold, uneven glow on the packet of divorce papers that now doubled as a coaster for his sweating glass of tap water. A knock rattled his door. He half expected it to be Melissa, irrational hope flickering in him for a second. It was the landlord, asking about rent. Ethan nodded, promised next Friday, and shut the door slower than he opened it. Meanwhile, back on Doris's block, something unexpected was happening. A tan sedan pulled into her driveway. A young woman stepped out, professional blazer, recorder in hand, and the kind of quiet confidence that only belonged to local journalists with deadlines. "Mrs. Whitman," she asked. Doris looked up from where she knelt by the flower bed. "Yes? I'm Erin McCauley with the Columbus Dispatch. We've been following the eviction case, and the community interest is overwhelming. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your side of the story for a Sunday feature." Doris stood slowly, brushed soil from her gloves, and tilted her head slightly. "Why now?" Erin smiled. "Because not every story about aging is about decline. Sometimes it's about setting the record straight." From the porch, Paula watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, already guessing what was coming next. Doris glanced at the house, her house, the one she'd built with 30 years of double shifts, pipe repairs, and Christmases without new shoes, so the roof could be fixed. She looked at her clean windows, her flowering dogwoods, her name on the mailbox. Finally, she said, "I'll think about it. But if I do tell it, I'll tell it from the beginning." The reporter nodded, excited. And inside her phone, the message from Ethan remained gone, unanswered, unmissed. The morning the article ran, Doris Whitman didn't need an alarm. The sun had barely crested over the rooftops when a knock sounded at her front door, firm, rapid, not frantic, but purposeful. She already knew what it was. On her porch sat a bundled copy of the Columbus Dispatch, dropped neatly beside her welcome mat. She picked it up with a steady hand and walked back inside, the newspaper crinkling under her fingers. She didn't flip to the front page right away. Instead, she brewed her coffee slowly, one scoop extra strong, let the drip pot hum in its familiar rhythm, and stared out the kitchen window at the trimmed lawn Ethan used to forget to mow. The garden hose coiled neatly like a comma at the side of the house. Only after her first sip did she open the paper. Columbus woman defends estate. Evic's entitled son. A stand for ownership, boundaries, and self-respect. Her picture filled half the page. Taken in front of the house, sunlight on her shoulder, chin lifted just slightly, proud but not boastful. Her expression was calm, eyes clear. No victim, no villain, just a woman who refused to be erased. Quotes from the article filled the space beneath. "No one talks about elder disrespect until it's already gotten out of hand," she said. "They assumed silence meant surrender. It never did. It wasn't just her voice, though." The article featured Trevor, who shared, "She was the sharpest person I worked with in property. Still is. And she owns that house, legally and morally." Shelby Moore's legal insight was quoted too. "Ms. Whitman followed every process to the letter. There was no vendetta, just enforcement of ownership rights." And nestled near the end was a statement from the judge's court transcript. "No individual, regardless of family ties, is exempt from the law, especially when those laws are meant to protect rightful ownership and dignity." Outside, the neighborhood buzzed. Word traveled quickly in Columbus suburbs, and this morning it traveled with purpose. By 9 a.m., the first knock came, not from press, not from court, but from Margaret Finch, 3 doors down, with a plate of scones and eyes bright with admiration. "Just had to say, good for you," she smiled. "You said what half of us only ever thought." By 10 a.m., 2 other neighbors had stopped by. Paula, naturally, was already sitting on Doris's porch, with her feet propped on the rail like she'd been waiting years for this day. "I always told you," Paula said, sipping iced tea from a mason jar. "You weren't done." "Just warming up," Doris chuckled, unfolding her copy of the paper. "Think it'll make the neighborhood Facebook group?" "It's already the banner photo," Paula replied. Across town, things were quieter. Melissa had officially moved back in with her mother. No fanfare. Just a car trunk full of designer bags and a face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She hadn't made a public comment about the case, not since the glass incident and not after the divorce. Ethan, meanwhile, was a ghost. No more posts, no shared photos, no updates. His once polished LinkedIn bio had quietly disappeared. Last anyone heard, he'd taken a part-time job at a storage facility near Franklinton, a far cry from the basement he'd thought belonged to someone else. Shelby stopped by the house that afternoon, handing Doris a small blue folder. Inside were the finalized documents, trust locked, restitution accounted for, and the deed now secured with ironclad protections. All signed and sealed, Shelby said, handing her the pen. Nobody touches this house again without a fireproof fight. Doris signed with no hesitation. Let them try. I've got my boots laced. They shared a quiet laugh. Later that evening, as golden light poured across her porch, Doris watered the tulips near the front steps. The nozzle hissed gently, and the breeze carried the scent of fresh soil and distant barbecue. The new locks on her front door caught the sunlight just so, metallic, unyielding. A subtle statement, perhaps, but firm. Just as she turned to head inside, Erin McCauley, the same reporter from the Dispatch, stepped up again. Notepad in hand, recorder clipped to her jacket. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, "congratulations again on the piece. We're getting incredible responses. Your story is resonating. People are talking about independence, inheritance, elder rights." Doris didn't interrupt, just waited. "But I have one more question." Off the record, Erin added. "What would you call this chapter of your life?" Doris looked out at her quiet, owned, unshakable home. She thought of basements, of laughter behind her back, of roses trimmed during legal wars, of her name, still etched on every legal page, still glowing on the mailbox. She smiled slightly. "Chapter," she said. No, this wasn't a chapter. It was the whole damn turning point. The house was still. Not empty, never empty, but still in a way Doris Whitman hadn't felt in years. Not since before voices echoed through its halls with entitlement and suggestion. Not since her own son had tried to exile her below her own floors like an afterthought. Now the air was honest again. Sunlight poured through the windows like warm approval, catching on the freshly polished floors and dancing across the pale trim. The scent of lemon oil clung gently in the air, mingling with a hint of brewed coffee and the fading perfume of Paula's gift bouquet from the day before. Hydrangeas and lilacs, carefully arranged in a wide glass vase that now sat center stage on the dining table, her dining table. Doris walked slowly through the house, not with hesitation but with reverence. The hardwood creaked in familiar ways under her slippers. She passed the repaired baseboards, now flawless. She paused at the upstairs landing, hand grazing the smooth banister Melissa once called dated. Funny how things seemed to age better when they weren't being insulted. She opened the closet across from the old guest room, now repainted and aired out. Inside, shelved neatly, was a new file box, labeled in sharp black letters, Whitman Property, Legacy Locked. Inside it, the deed, the trust, the court records. Everything in her name, sealed with time and intention. A knock interrupted her peace, but not rudely. She knew that knock. Trevor stood outside with a box of hardware store cookies and a tool belt still slung across one shoulder. "Couldn't help myself," he said, smiling. "Had to see how it all looked finished." Doris waved him in with a chuckle. "You're lucky I didn't change the locks again." Trevor stepped inside and took it in, the way a contractor would, eyes skimming every seam and surface. "Feels like it's breathing again," he said finally. "You gave it lungs." Doris nodded. It never stopped breathing. It just had mold clogging up its good sense. They laughed, and it echoed warmly through the halls. Not sharp like Melissa's laugh had been. Not hollow like Ethan's awkward chuckles at her expense. Trevor didn't stay long. Just enough time to share a cookie, compliment her new dining chairs, and leave with a satisfied look. He didn't offer any advice, didn't talk about legacy or loss. He just said, "Nice work," before the screen door clicked shut behind him. Paula arrived next. No knock this time, just a gentle thunk as she set something on the porch. Doris opened the door to find her neighbor adjusting the bow on a simple bouquet of daisies in a mason jar. on the card, scribbled in blue ink. No basements in this story. P. Doris smirked. You're gonna make me soft, Paula. Please, you'd armor a tissue box if I let you. They hugged quickly, two women who had seen too much, said too little, and finally decided silence was for people with regrets. Inside, Doris passed through the kitchen and placed the daisies beside the hydrangeas. Her eyes then drifted toward the hallway bookshelf, where a small, unexpected frame now sat. The eviction notice, signed, dated, processed. She'd pressed it between museum-grade glass, clean white mat board around it, and a brass plate underneath that read, Resolved, October 19th, by owner. It wasn't bitterness that made her keep it. It was memory. Proof that some lines, once drawn, could hold the weight of home. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and took it to the front window. The street was quiet. Leaves rustled lazily in the breeze. The mailbox stood repaired, upright, and freshly painted. A few houses down, a kid on a bike tossed a newspaper onto a neighbor's porch, the same way hers had landed weeks ago with that front-page headline. Her story had run, and the world had kept spinning, but differently. Lighter, a few more voices had spoken up. 2 other women from her senior center had asked for Shelby's number. Her phone rang less with demands, more with gratitude. She sipped slowly, savoring the heat, the quiet. And that's when it hit her, not the silence, but what it meant. Peace wasn't passive. It had to be earned, preserved, reinforced like Joyce beneath the floor. Hers had been tested, rattled, nearly broken, but it had held. From the basement to the court bench, from the file cabinet to the front page, she had stood her ground, and she had won. Through the glass she caught her reflection faintly superimposed over the street. Not just a silhouette of a woman, but of ownership, resolve, and something harder to name, something deeper. The past had tried to reassign her story, but the house remained hers. Not because she clung to it, but because she claimed it. She smiled, soft and slow. They sent me to the basement for a week, she whispered aloud, voice low and certain. I sent them to the basement of regret forever.